National Transport, now ambassador based in Washington, Noel Lynch. And he would have been having discussions with Prime Minister Arthur. I always referred to him even after 2008 as Prime Minister Arthur. He was having discussions with Prime Minister Arthur. And I remember we concluded, and it didn't take much, to say that he was bright, and he had the capacity and the ability to put things in the correct perspective. And I think, sir, that one of the things that helped him to move from humble beginnings to greatness related, sir, to education. And he made use of every educational opportunity. He understood the value of education. And I think his recognition of how you could utilize education to transform your life was reflected in his commitment to facilitate a graduate in every household. And during this tribute, sir, I'm going to reflect on a few things that he has said. And I believe that those things that he has said, things such as that we must have a graduate in every household, really reflect a true commitment and care for Barbadians, and a desire to ensure that through his actions and through the policies that he was able to shape, that Barbadians would be able to develop to their full potential. There's no doubt, sir, in my mind, that late Prime Minister Arthur was indeed a teacher. And I have to say to this chamber that there is a lot that I have learned from him. And you know, sir, sometimes you don't recognize the extent of the influence of an individual until you start really to reflect on the time that you have known them, and reflect on the different conversations that you have had, and reflect on the different things that they've done to influence your life. And sir, I remember on many occasions having the privilege of going to cabinet. Of course, Prime Minister Arthur provided an opportunity for me as Parliamentary Secretary in the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport. And I maybe should reflect very briefly on a discussion I was having at lunch with Senator Drakes. And you know, sometimes people see in you what you do not see in yourself. And I think that Prime Minister Arthur was very good in being able to identify individuals to do certain things. And I well recall when I got that call from him asking me to serve in the capacity of Parliamentary Secretary in Tourism and International Transport and to be a senator. To be quite honest, sir, I wondered why. Why tourism and international transport? I had had absolutely no exposure to that. As you know, sir, I had functioned in the Ministry of Industry and International Business, where you, sir, were minister. And thanks for all of your guidance and helping me to be who I am today as well. And at that time, I worked as senior consultant with the reform of the industrial sector, mainly manufacturing, and also with telecommunications, but never anything with tourism and international transport. And I reflect on that because, you know, today I was in and out of the chamber. And the truth is, tourism and international transport is now my day-to-day area that I function in. It's the basket and hoe that I have. It's the way that I make my living. And the truth is that Prime Minister Arthur obviously saw something and gave me that opportunity to develop in who I am today. But, sir, as I said, I recall going to cabinet on many occasions, acting in different capacities, of course, as Minister of Tourism and International Transport, Public Works, a whole range of ministries. And sitting in the cabinet and hearing Prime Minister Arthur talk was truly a lesson from a teacher. And many of those things I carry with me today. I remember, sir, in reflecting on different subject matters, Prime Minister Arthur saying there must be clarity of thought. You must be very clear on what it is that you are speaking about, and you must present it and fashion it the right way. I remember him saying, sir, in addition to clarity of thought, there must be sense of purpose. Because you must have, sir, a very clear communication and indication as to what it is you are trying to achieve. And then he also said there must be reflection on the expected outcomes. And some might say, sir, that as Prime Minister, he was a very hard taskmaster. But I think, sir, that is something that is extremely good, because it required that those who function within government give of their very best. It required that persons recognize that we had a commitment to ensure that what we did was not for ourselves, but was for the benefit as well of the people of the country and the people of the region. Persons here have spoken to the fact that when there have been challenges, I've heard him say on many occasions, face it and fix it. Meaning, sir, that you must not run away when the challenges come. You must not say you're overwhelmed and you can't deal with it. You must face it and fix it. And I think that, sir, is critical and that is important. Another saying, sir, that Prime Minister Arthur had that I embrace fully was that to whom much is given, much is expected. And those of us, sir, who serve in this place, and those of us who serve at a senior level in government and throughout Barbados have to recognize that there are certain privileges, yes, that we have, but we also have to use those privileges to the benefit of the ordinary man and the ordinary woman. And yes, sir, many of us, there's a lot that we have, but we have to learn, sir, to share and to give. And there can be no doubt that Prime Minister Arthur gave of himself, and gave of himself in a major way to help transform this country. I also, too, remember, sir, being able to put a position to Prime Minister Arthur. And sometimes, you go to have a discussion and you have to be well prepared. You never know, sir, what questions may be asked. I well recall, sir, being asked to prepare a brief and take it to Ilar Court. I remember you giving the instructions, sir. And the next day going to a meeting with Prime Minister Arthur, and you think to yourself, well, look, Prime Minister got this brief late, man. He can't read everything, man. A joke, man. Minister, man, a joke, man. Mr. President, sir, man, you know as minister, man, that he read every single letter, man. And of course, there were times I heard him say to people who presented papers, oh, man, you don't seem to have written your own paper. Look at page such and such. So you had to be prepared. But if you were able, in representing your case, to do it properly and effectively, he used to say, and there was a request that you made, he used to say, let it be done. Let it be done. And that, for me, suggested that he well understood and appreciated the position that you put. Sir, of course, I could not speak in this tribute without making reference to the politics of inclusion. And I guess some would say that I am a beneficiary of the politics of inclusion. Some would say that. But I have to tell you, sir, that I am extremely happy that I have come from the wilderness of the Democratic Labour Party into the light here with the Barbados Labour Party. Extremely happy about that, sir. And you know, sometimes we ourselves as adults don't understand what is happening around us. I remember the 1999 election campaign. I then, sir, as you know, would have been in the wilderness as a candidate for the Democratic Labour Party. Tyrone Eswick and I, the late Tyrone Eswick, my very good friend, we were talking about what we needed to do in Christchurch. He being in Christchurch East then, sir, of course, facing a formidable opponent. And he was well defeated and beaten. And I, at the time, sir, would have been in Christchurch West Central. So we were talking about the things that we needed to do in Christchurch. And Tyrone's daughter, Ashley, and my daughter, Rashina, they're in close proximity. And Ashley asked Tyrone, Daddy, you're all running for the Dems? And Rashina said, Daddy, you're all running for the Dems? And we said, yes, we are running for the Dems. And they laughed. And we asked, why are you laughing? They said, we're going with Owen. So these are the children of the LP candidates. And in 1999, they're telling us, going with Owen. And the truth is, the country was going with Owen because in him, they found someone that could inspire. In him, they found someone that could give confidence. Remember that he took over office at a time when the foreign reserves were low. He took over office at a time when unemployment was in excess of 25%. And I remember him saying that he would create 30,000 jobs. And I have to be honest to this chamber and say that at the time, I was not sure that the 30,000 jobs could be created. But he created 30,000 plus jobs, sir. He created more than the 30,000 jobs that he said that he would create. And the reality is that he was able, as in a very serious way, to take a country that faced disaster. And as I reflect on his life, and sir, certainly I can recall the 1994 election and where we were. And I can recall the 2018 election where you had a Democratic Labour Party in government that brought the country close to disaster. And it seems as though whenever the Dems get in office, when they demit, the country is always close to a disaster. And I think that we owe a great gratitude to Prime Minister Arthur for the work that he did, particularly in taking over government in 1994. And we have to, sir, as well, reflect on the fact that he became Prime Minister by bringing a no-confidence motion against a government and stop the government literally during the midterm. You would have had elections, sir, before in 1966, 1971, 1976, 1981, 1986, 1991. But the election that persons were anticipating would have been in 1996 did not occur in 1996 because Prime Minister Arthur, as leader of the opposition, would have brought a no-confidence motion, and that no-confidence motion brought to an end the Democratic Labour Party's reign in government and provided relief to the people of Barbados. But the functioning of Prime Minister Arthur just did not relate to Barbados. There was a time in the 1990s, sir, the United States Shipwright Agreement. I believe it would have been spoken about in this chamber before. where the United States sought to impact on the sovereignty of CARICOM countries. And while some of our other Caribbean neighbors decided that they would go ahead, Prime Minister Arthur said no. And I well recall, sir, his speech in Trinidad, where he stood firm to the United States, and he was strong. And that resulted in a significant change in the shipwrighter agreement. It didn't stop there either, sir. There was reference as well to the OECD countries and the kind of impact that they sought to bring on our international businesses, and the ability of Prime Minister Arthur to stand up strong. And I think what he did was reflected in the progression of the country for the Kofi Annan, sir, who was then Secretary General of the UN, stating that Barbados was a country which punched above its weight. He, sir, had lead responsibility for the Caribbean single market and economy, which allowed a number of Caribbean nationals to function here. And I do well recall, sir, another late Prime Minister making comments about ever so welcome, wait for a call. And what that did was to deny us of the opportunity of utilizing the resources of our Caribbean brothers and sisters. The reality is that Prime Minister Arthur was strong integrationalist, very, very strong. And he recognized that we were better functioning together than we were functioning apart and functioning as independent nations. And therefore, there was a significant thrust which he made at the level of the Caribbean single market and economy. And I think it benefited Barbados significantly, particularly in the area of services. Sir, I couldn't end in my tribute without reflecting on some easier, more social times I got to spend with Prime Minister Arthur. There were times, sir, when after a branch meeting, he would say, "Rudy Grant, let us go." And we would go to Bert's Bar and sit down and have a few beverages and speak in a light manner. Or we would go by Rudy Gibson, the B-man, and play some dominoes. And, of course, enjoy delectable fish cakes made by Miss Gibson. And there I saw another Owen Arthur. Very sociable, very easy, full of fun. I remember once during a dominoes game, I pretended that I didn't have a good hand at all, man. I was complaining things didn't look good, things didn't look good and things. But I had a good hand. And as my opportunity came, and I slammed and I won the game, he said, I have to watch you. You would cut your throat with a feather. He had some sayings, and those sayings really, really, truly inspired you. The last time I spoke with Prime Minister Arthur was on June 30th at the reopening of Primo. And again, a teacher. We sat, he spoke on that occasion, and Minister Cummins was there that night. He spoke in relation to CARICOM and his concerns with respect to maintaining CARICOM unity. Of course, we had no determination with respect to the elections in Guyana. And we spoke in relation to that. And we also spoke with respect to LIAD. But you should have seen Prime Minister Arthur sitting and all of us gathered around and teaching, and in full control of the discussion. We will certainly miss Prime Minister. As I said, he's a man who inspired, a man who did his best to create a a positive Barbados. He was a skilled politician. He was a visionary, a great Caribbean statesman. And I want to say to his family, his wife Julie, his daughters Sabrina and Leah, who is not here with us, to Richard and to all other members of the family, Valmir and others, and other siblings, that we grieve with you. We really do. It is difficult to lose someone that we love. It is difficult to lose someone that we respect. But you can be inspired by the fact that former late Prime Minister, Professor the Right Honorable Owen Arthur, did a lot to transform Barbados, did a lot to improve the lives of Barbadians. And you can be assured that we stand with you and we support you. You can be assured that he will not be forgotten, and be assured as well that as we live our lives, we will emulate those very positive elements that he would have portrayed, and we would seek in our own way to make Barbados a better place for all Barbadians and those who come here. Sir, on behalf of myself and my family, I certainly want to acknowledge all that Prime Minister Arthur would have done, and to wish, sir, that he will rest eternal, and that light perpetual, sir, will shine upon him. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Grant. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. It is an honor to greet you for the first time in this place since your appointment. And I wish to extend my own greetings to the family, to Julie, to Sabrina, and to Richard, and all of the other members of the family by blood and otherwise, and also to recognize Anne, who, if you know, former Professor Right Honorable Owen Arthur, you know Anne he saw as family as well. So I stand today, Mr. President, to pay tribute to the late Professor Owen Arthur, the Right Honorable former Prime Minister of Barbados, as one of those persons about whom we spoke earlier, one of those persons who now hold office in government, who he would have mentored over many years. I first met Prime Minister Arthur as a young Foreign Service officer, Mr. President. I probably may have been in my early 20s, and at the time I was working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and he was Prime Minister. He was a legend in every possible way, because I had come from a background as a university student at the University of the West Indies at Mona campus, as an urbanite living in a hall across from Chancellor Hall, where he was a chancellor, right, and in his own right, a legend before I even came to Barbados and met him. And there I was a student and would have seen him on more than one occasion come up to Jamaica and return to Chancellor Hall, as many of us did as students who went back to our alma mater and to our roots as hall leaders. I recall then coming into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. President, and engaging with this legend, first from my assignment in the Protocol Division, where I oftentimes had to go to meet him at the airport. And he was always this very affable personality who spoke with everyone. But then I really got to meet him and to understand who he was when I was the CARICOM National Focal Point for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he, in his office, led the National Focal Point. And we interacted often. I was always struck by his vision for regionalism. And we've spoken a lot about regionalism, and I think that's where many of us who were mentored by him, who he took under his wing, then became regionalist. I remember long conversations with him around things like the single investment regime. He felt that harmonization was insufficient. He felt that we needed to deepen our coordination and we needed to go even further. He believed in supranationalism, and so he felt that the CARICOM needed to engage in what he called multilateral pooled sovereignty. Those were the concepts that he taught us long before many of us were regionalists ourselves, and so we almost by osmosis absorbed much of that from him. He talks about things like production integration, Mr. President. And I remember, because he introduced me to the concept of production integration, when I subsequently wrote my master's thesis in international trade, I wrote on the spatial allocation of production integration in the CARICOM region. And that was driven very heavily by Oinatha's influence on a young professional like myself. I remember the first time I traveled with him. At the time, I was based in Washington, D.C. He was prime minister, and we were in Mexico. And it was one night, I had the privilege of coming up both at his feet and that of Dame Billy Miller, another great in the Barbados Labour Party. And we were out one night, and we were contemplating what was going to happen about this vexatious issue of Haiti. And it was an intriguing thing for me to sit and listen to Dame Billy and Prime Minister Arthur at the time rationalize what they were going to do to treat to this issue. I believe former President Bertrand Aristide had left under curious circumstances. CARICOM was navigating what should be done under the Civil Society Agreement for CARICOM, the Protocol on Civil Society, and there were all kinds of issues, and the U.S. government and others, the OAS at that time, everyone was having this conversation with Haiti. And I always remember his words that night. And he said, "Let everybody come. I am ready for them." He said, "Monkey know who to jump on. You must let them know." He was very clear in his language that he was not a pushover. And if you listen to anybody talk about him in multilateral settings, in political settings, he always had the last word. He was very clear and deliberate in everything that he had to say. And he was not willing to be pushed over by anybody. That was the Oinatha that I knew and I came to respect. He had some interesting views on social policy. Social policy for those who are Barbadians who he believed strongly needed to feel as though they had a voice and a stake and a place in the highest decision-making tables. But he also felt that social rights were applicable to those in the region that he loved. And it was one of the reasons why he imbued in all of us a commitment to the concept of contingent rights. And I know it was a thing of great pleasure for him when we finally found ourselves with an agreement on contingent rights in the Caribbean, which would allow CARICOM nationals to benefit from social services as they moved. In the latter years, Mr. President, it was a thing of beauty to watch myself evolve into a young professional woman, having left the ministry. And when I left the ministry and I was going to Uganda to work, I remember having a conversation with him, and I said to him, "I don't know if I should go." He says, "Young Cummins, you have to go. You have to go. But listen, you have to come back." You have to come back. And he was very clear, "You have to come back. I expect you to come back." I came back. But as fate would have it, I came back then. And I remember we spent quite a lot of time in this particular institution. Mr. President, the Barbados Coalition of Service Industries at the time recruited me to come back home. I came back home. And I heard again, but you know that this was a creation of former Prime Minister Arthur. And so I made my way to him again, and he said, "This is what you have to do. This is what I've envisioned. Services is a priority." And he was very clear every single time. He had no ambiguity. He lived life professionally and in every other way intentionally. And he says, "This is what has to happen." And he would talk me through, but throughout all of those things, he almost would say to me, "Cummins, when are you going to come into politics now?" And I would say, Prime Minister. Prime Minister. He was no longer Prime Minister by that time, but I always still call him Prime Minister. No, leave me alone. And he pushed and he pushed and he pushed. But I never took it down. Then our daughters became friends at Queen's College. And for many years, myself, former Prime Minister, Julie, we would carpool several days a week. And many evenings, if I was running late, either former Prime Minister or Julie would pick up my daughter, and vice versa. We would pick them up and take them to each other's houses. He would make pepper pot and he would say, "Come and eat. Where are those girls?" Sometimes I would get a call and he would say, I have a package here waiting for you. On my coconut trees outside of my home, I have orchids that he brought because he was so proud of his garden. And I had no idea what to do with them, and he came and he put them up for me. That is the Owen that I also knew. But I want to draw the Chamber's attention to the former Prime Minister who, in his words, travailed over our nation over a period of 10 years. When I was approached by the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies to join the university team, again, I went to former Prime Minister Arthur. What should I do? Should I accept the offer or should I go to the university? Cummins, you have to go to the university. And it's a regional institution. If you don't go, I'll be very unhappy with you. And so I went to the University of the West Indies. Off I went. He says, I'll help you. And as fate would have it, it turned out that my office was adjacent to his. As you know, he dedicated his library and his collection of impressive papers. If you have not yet seen his collection in his library, it is a thing to behold. He had in his possession, and it empowered me over the last 4 or 5 years to be able to go next door from my office into his office, borrowing books almost on a weekly basis, and he would say, you have to read this book. If he ordered a new book, he would say, here, you have to take this one. You have to come back. Or to see his library if there was a paper that had been written on a subject. When I was delivering the second Dame Ermy-Bourne lecture, it was to his library that I went. And I'm confident that now a lot of the work that we are seeing on the Scotland District and in those areas in terms of the Scotland Development Authority, Scotland District Development Authority, those are things that were among his last acts before he left office in 2008. And he shared much of those papers with me right before I gave that lecture. But I remember, Mr. President, one day I went into his office, probably to borrow a book, probably to go into the library, probably just to hear him ranting about something or the other that was troubling him in the last 10 years, and he was on his couch. Come in. I opened and he was laying on his couch and his hand was on his head. I said, Prime Minister, what's the matter? Come in. I'm in travail. What's wrong? I'm in travail for your country. He was deeply affected by what happened in the country over that period when he demitted office. And he spent a considerable amount of time writing papers, engaging with people, giving lectures. There is a lecture that he gave in 2012, for example, and it was called The Logic of Integration. And he spoke about a number of things which we've subsequently had to battle. You would recall, Mr. President, when you, for example, were dealing with the difficult issues of financial services, and others were treating to the OECD issues from multiple perspectives. These were things that he was well known for, and he said something at the time that in 2012 that I want to share with the House here, because we still in this Senate are grappling with many of those issues, and I believe just 2 years ago we left the Senate maybe around 11 o'clock the night treating to international business issues. In 2012 he said this: it would be unrealistic for us to expect to be favored by a level playing field in the new global economy. Rather, even in areas where we have competitive advantages, such as the operation of our international financial centers, we can and should expect constant turbulence, such as the operation of our financial services. He says, as developed countries seek to control and monopolize the most lucrative areas of activity in the global economy. This merely heightens the need for us to build new cooperative mechanisms by which to collectively defend our interests. We're still battling those issues that he spoke to in 2008 and before, and after he demitted office in 2012. We're still trying to battle with the OECD and dealing with the constant designation of being a harmful tax jurisdiction. We're still challenged by the issues with regard to our financial centers. These are issues that he felt very strongly about. He called them what is termed existential threats. And we are still talking about those things today. But here is one of the key things about his legacy. He always believed in transformation. And here it is that in this moment, we are in an administration that is again grappling with existential threats, grappling with all of the global issues that surround us that have that pose a threat to who we are, while at the same time attempting to invest in transformation. If this is not the legacy of what Owenatha, the Right Honourable Owenatha, thereafter deemed Professor, the Right Honourable Owenatha by the University of the West Indies, because of his contribution to the development agenda, there is nothing that would do justice to him but the transformation agenda. And so he did not speak to issues in a superficial way. He didn't speak to issues off the cuff, and he was never emotional. He was always considered, he was always well researched, he was always meaningful and intentional, and he always took a long-range view of a development issue that led not just to the transformation of a country or a region, but he believed in Caribbean civilization and therefore of a people. It is these things, Mr. President, that as we go into this next wave of our development in the post-COVID era, that will help to guide our development agenda. We have a long history, and I call it the institutional scaffolding. We have an obligation, and I certainly feel an obligation, as a student of the Owenatha University, I call it that, because many of us have sat at his feet for many, many years. We have a duty, as we go into this phase, to be the institutional scaffolding on which our next wave of development is built. We have an obligation to advance the small states agenda. We have an obligation to advance the small island developing states agenda. We have an obligation to advance special and differential treatment for small states. We have an obligation to invest in the development agenda through global foreign policy development. We have an obligation to invest in issues relating to climate change and resilience and vulnerability planning. Those are all key issues that dominated Owenatha's agenda. But he also ensured that as we talked about those high-level macroeconomic policy issues and those foreign policy issues that all led to our development, that people, everyday people, were at the center of his consideration. We have an obligation to ensure that we keep people at the center. We have an obligation to ensure that we are driven by empirical-based analysis. We can't make off-the-cuff decisions. The data must guide us. What is the research? What is the context? What is the mischief, as Prime Minister today will say to us all the time, that you're trying to correct? These are the things that have come from the Owenatha School of Thought. And if in this moment, Mr. President, where we are dealing with a series of existential threats to our public health, to our economic development, to our social economic and our social fabric, as we're treating to the question of unemployment, for example, and economic malaise, we have to treat to these key development tenets of the Owenatha School. We have to be able to pay tribute to those who have gone before us and who have laid a foundation. We have to be able to lay the next layer of the scaffolding that will bring those who follow behind us up, rather than kicking down the ladder. We have an obligation to support the institutions at the University of the West Indies and the wider education agenda. We have an obligation to social justice and social inclusion. And I'm committed, Mr. President, as I walk my own journey in public life, to keep my eyes focused on the things that I've learned over many years as a young officer, as a young professional, to the place where I am now, and to ensure that in all I do, I honor the man who invested so much in so many of us to ensure that we were able to make a meaningful contribution to public life. And with those few words, I give honor to him. I call for continued support of his family who have shared him with the nation and shared him with many of us. And I send my condolences and my greetings and my love to Julie and Leah and Sabrina and all the members of his family who I know miss him dearly and who have had the pleasure, on the one hand, of hearing the glowing tributes of their loved one all the time, but also I am in no doubt it must be incredibly difficult to sit through these processes at all times, having shared your loved one with a nation. So my condolences to you, my love and my appreciation and continued support at all times. Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummins. Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President. And first, let me also congratulate you, Mr. President, on your election of this as president of this honorable chamber. And I know that you will do an exemplary job as you take charge of this chamber, and I wish you well. Um, I, Mr. President, unlike most of the previous speakers, cannot claim to have had that any personal or even any professional relationship with Professor Arthur. And so, to a large extent, my few comments are really related to my observations of him as he operated in the public service and as the head of government for those 15 years and prior during his years in opposition. And I have to say that when at some time his biography is written, when at some time history is written, I am satisfied that the work that he would have done during the period of which he gave service to this country will be properly recorded, and that we will be able to see the tremendous contribution he made in terms of the development of this country. I think there's a considerable body of thought that his mentor was probably former Prime Minister also, the Right Excellent Earl Walton Barrow. And the more I think about it and the more I reflect on this, I see a lot of the telling similarities of the Barrow era coming through during the period of Professor Arthur's prime ministership. We have a number of speakers have reflected on it. His strong commitment to education as a means of enfranchising the poor and underprivileged Barbadians. Of course, his deepening the regional integration movement. And I venture to say that when some of the other leaders of the Caribbean were merely lukewarm and didn't appear to be that interested in seeing CARICOM move ahead, he was always in the vanguard of pushing for CARICOM. And I would say he was an unrepentant regionalist. And therefore, it is really important to see how, when he had the opportunity, how he tried to push the development of the integration movement, and of course, the work that he would have done in the establishing, in trying to get the CSME up and running. I think, Mr. President, if his push for integration had been more accepted by others and others had the same enthusiasm he had, perhaps a lot of the issues which are still surfacing today may have been resolved. And I think of things like the same LIAT, which he subsequently came back and tried to work with the issues in Guyana and other regional issues which we now have to face, the attempts by some to try to divide the region. If we had pursued our regionalism with the vigor that the late Professor Arthur had for the whole institution of CARICOM, I think this region would have been way far ahead at this point. And of course, COVID and all the issues surrounding COVID now really, again, brings to mind the importance of that whole integration movement. Of course, one of the things that struck me was his ability to interact with everybody in his community. You know, whether it was at some of his famous places of refreshment, or whether it was in the supermarket. I heard some others mention of meeting up with him in the supermarket. He always was able to interact with people at whatever level. And in fact, I was reminded quite recently by one of my sisters of an occasion just after the 2008 elections when the Arthur government had lost the election. And my sister relates to me that she was actually in the supermarket shopping with her young son, at that time I believe about seven or 8 years. And he saw Mr. Arthur in the supermarket and he said, "Mommy, there is Prime Minister Owen Arthur." And he ran up to him to say, "Hello, Prime Minister Arthur." And of course, Mr. Arthur, because he was not Prime Minister then, said, "Well, son, that's true. I am Mr. Arthur, but I am no longer Prime Minister." And the little boy asked him, "You are not Prime Minister anymore?" He said, "No." He said, "So what happened?" The Prime Minister and Mr. Arthur said to him, "Well, I don't know. I must have done something wrong." But the little boy said to him, "But anyway, you're still my hero." And he took that with him right through, and he's now even boasting because he's a student at the university in Jamaica, and he's boasting that he's at the same university that Prime Minister Arthur attended. So this is the type of individual he was, and for which I admire him. I have to tell you also, Mr. President, you know, my brother who studied with Mr. Arthur in Jamaica, and who every time on the occasions when I had to meet Mr. Arthur would always say, "Your brother was always my liming buddy in Jamaica." But my brother always tells me that he was always impressed with the manner in which he mentored the students of economics who were studying it, particularly the Barbadian students. He virtually took them under his wings and coached them. And it is this love for the young people and seeing them progress and seeing them have a university education. I don't remember if it was Professor Arthur, or if it was the Chancellor, the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the university at the time, Professor Hilary Beckles, who said that they would look forward to the day when there would at least be one university student in every house in Barbados. Whether Arthur said it or whether Beckles said it, I don't remember, but the point is, I know it was endorsed by Prime Minister, by Professor Arthur. And they also well remember, and back in the year of Hurricane Ivan in Jamaica. And they remember it well because my daughter at the time was studying in Jamaica. And I think, actually, Mr. President, you were then Minister of Education. And the government at the time made sure that once the hurricane had passed, that a plane was chartered and they brought the students back home to Barbados so that they had that little time to give them a little respite to recover from the unusual circumstances of that hurricane, which none of them had ever experienced before. And that shows to me and demonstrates the level of concern and appreciation he had for the young people and for making sure that he put everything possible in place for them to succeed. We all, of course, would have been, as citizens of Barbados when he was Prime Minister, we would all, of course, been impacted in some way by his policies. I particularly think of the time when he was when he was trying to make sure that he created a climate of people and persons in Barbados who wanted to save and to invest. And he did it through a number of incentives and tax breaks and so on. And I can honestly say that I was the beneficiary of it because prior to my retirement, long time before I actually retired, I was putting in place a plan for my retirement. And I was able to use things like the registered retirement savings plan. I was able to use the fact that you could invest in public companies and create and claim that investment as a tax credit. And these are the sort of things that help to generate and to create in the middle class the idea that we don't have to necessarily be workers all our life, but that we should start to see ourselves as investors and investing as something that we should also be involved in. There was after he left, or I shouldn't say after he left politics, but after he resigned or parted company with the Barbados, the party for which he was a member for over 30 years. He sat as an independent, of course, in the other place. And to my mind, he began to demonstrate the qualities of the elder statesman. And I suppose he's now being freed from the shackles of being a political person or being part of a party and being in politics. He freely offered his advice and direction for the benefit of his beloved country. And I would suggest that when we all have time, we go back and we look at those speeches pre 2014, I think it was, when he parted company with the Barbados Labour Party. And look at those speeches, look at those debates in which he participated, and you see the wisdom and you see how deep those contributions, and you get a much better appreciation for how deep those contributions were. I am told, Mr. President, and and this is from speaking with a number of permanent secretaries, from chief technical officers, people who would have worked at that level. And it is interesting that almost without exception, they were saying that, in fact, one person suggested he never advised himself, but he relied on the advice of his professional people. So he didn't surround himself with people who would tell him what they think he wanted to hear. But he wanted a professional, he wanted professional advice, and then at the end of the day, maybe he had to make a political decision, but the point is that he never accepted anything but professionalism. And as we heard from some of the other speakers, you had to go prepared. Mr. President, I would say that Professor Arthur, he did make some mistakes, but like all of us, that just reflected his humanity. And he from time to time did admit that he did make some mistakes. But those for his contribution to this country and what he have done in terms of the development of this country really far outweigh any mistakes that he may have had made along the way. And I would just like to, and perhaps, Mr. President, just to mention one other thing before we wrap up. It was mentioned, I think, by Senator Grant a little while ago about the 1999 election. And there's something that I always remember about that election, because by the 1999 elections, it seemed that he had been able to amass such a popularity with all of the citizens that I recall hearing people who were of the other party's persuasion saying, for this election, we are still these, but we are for these. And that shows the level of satisfaction, I think, and gratitude. And the fact that his call to be the person that he wanted to have in his government, he wanted his party, and under his government, he wanted to practice the politics of inclusion. And I don't think they were empty words. And I think that all reflects, as I say, his popularity and how he came through as others. So I think, Mr. President, he has a tremendous legacy. He has done well for this country. And I would just wish that his legacy will live on until time shall be no more, and that those now in politics and those who will follow will seriously attempt to emulate this brilliant Barbadian late Professor Oinaf. And so I take this opportunity to express my sincere condolences to his family, to his wife, to his daughters, his other relatives. Richard, of course, I know Richard very well, and we are brothers in another way. And I trust that in time there will be some appropriate monument or whatever to forever remember and reflect on his contribution to Barbados. I am obliged to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. Senator Reverend Dr. John Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and good afternoon, my fellow. I wish to, in following the practice today, welcome you, sir, to this chamber as president, and we look forward to your guidance of the chamber as we go forward. It would have been a grave omission for me not to say anything in honor of the late Professor, the Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur, though I cannot remember ever having a conversation with him. But he was such a colossal figure in the landscape of our politics and social engineering here in Barbados that it would be an omission not to speak of his prowess. I believe that there will always be a generation of Barbadians upon whom the image of the late Professor Arthur and his exploits will be etched, because there was a generation that would have gone through their entire primary school and secondary school life with Owen Arthur being their prime minister, and would have witnessed the juggernaut that was the Barbados Labour Party at the time, and some will say still is, but I'll say I'm speaking of that time, as they entered election after election, pummeling their opponents. And it got to the point where, whether intentionally or not, either the party became Owen Arthur or Owen Arthur became the party. Because after a while, you couldn't remember which theme was used for which election, because all of them had Owen in them somewhere. But such was the nature of the man. He came to national recognition as our prime minister in the 14 years between 1994 and 2008. And he would have inherited a government that was tottering at the time. The economy was in shambles. The national morale was very low after the 8% cut and the challenge that many families and individuals would have been experiencing at the time. And true to his motto, face it and fix it, he did just that. He presided over what will always be recognized as a purple patch in the development of Barbados. But it was a purple patch not because everything was smooth, but because of his astute leadership and his willingness to face the obstacles head on. One cannot help but think that as a good classical scholar, he would have held very closely to the words of Brutus in Julius Caesar. There's a tide in the affairs of men, which when taken at the flood leads to fortunes. Omitted, one's voyage of life is but shallows and misery. And he would have taken that flood when it presented itself to lead to the social and national development that we would have experienced under his leadership. But as you would have heard this today, and we must reiterate, one of his great strengths was his political maturity, the ability to go beyond the divisions of party, to recognize talent wherever it was. Because, as I said, I never spoke to him, but I'm sure that as a great student of history, he would have recognized that long before there were political parties and B&D, we were a people never meant to be. And so he was able to go beyond the boundaries of politics to see talent and value wherever it was. And so today we are really celebrating the true essence of the Barbadian experiment, that as a society, we can focus on the development of our people, where though he was not born a king, he rose from the levels, the basic levels of his society, to walk with princes and kings. He had the ability to transcend every stratum of the society, where he was able to mix with the greatest in academia, but also to relate to the ordinary man on the street. So much so that he was immortalized in Calypso by Kid Sight, Only About Hair. And you may remember the time when we had the problem in Emerton. And as Kid Sight said, but Owen went down there, touch a Rasta man on the hair. I am sorry, Owen declared. Well, that could happen, only about hair. Such was the nature of the man. He had the ability to touch people at every level. I had some cursory instances where I would have been in the company of Mr. Arthur, though I don't think he ever knew me, really. I do recall that sometime in the mid-2000s, he had called a national consultation for religious leaders. I can remember standing outside on the morning of that consultation, a group of us religious leaders, and he came up to us and he said, "Listen, gentlemen, the time of the economists is past. It is now time for you to build this society. It is time for you to do the social engineering necessary to make this society what it should be." I would have interacted with him again at Sheraton Center when he was not prime minister anymore and he was just sitting there. It was after a time of brief illness, and I just asked him how he was doing, and he was quite nice in responding and so on. But I also shared a political platform with him one time, sir. And this is for the leader of government business. Prior to the 2008 elections, sir, I was asked by the candidate of the Barbados Labour Party for St. George South if I would come and bless his constituency office. And as the extreme independent that I am, I decided that I would go, sir. The afternoon, as my wife was driving me to the venue, we saw the Prime Minister's car in front of us, so I said, well, he must be going where I'm going. So we followed his car, and we both got lost, and we found that quite funny. But then when we got to the place, it was not just the blessing of a constituency office. It was a political meeting. There was a sea of red. So he got out the car, and I heard the announcement, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister of Barbados," there's this big uproar and everything. So I told my wife, all right, let's give it some minutes to cool down, and then I'll just slip out and go in. But when I got out, the person who was on the microphone knew me. "Ladies and gentlemen, the rector of St. Luke." So I was welcomed at the political meeting, sir. And I sat on the platform with Mr. Arthur, then Prime Minister Arthur. And that was the time when he gave one of his blistering speeches. I believe that was the Wild Boy speech. And I was on the platform with him at that time, sir. So I just wanted the leader of government business to know that I was there. But in recent times, I had the opportunity to share in the Jobs and Investment Committee with Mr. Arthur, and as you spoke this morning, Teresa, the leader of government business spoke this morning, he was so animated in those sessions. It was refreshing seeing him just pontificating on just about everything. And you felt like you were in the company of an elder statesman who could help us to clear the quagmire that we're experiencing at this time. I always remember at one of those meetings he said, listen, people, we are in survival mode. Let's just focus on getting the country where it needs to be. I also got some information about him and his experiences with others as well. I was told by a teacher who would go down to Jamaica to mark exams every year that one year they got there, and just as they were at the check-in counter for the hotel, all tired after their long flight, a voice behind them said, "I hear Bajans." And it was the Prime Minister, Owen Arthur, at the time. And he said, "What are you here for?" And they said, "We're here to mark CXC." He said, "Well, anyway, I'm off to a function." And he told his permanent secretary, "Wait for them, make sure they get changed and everything, get some transportation, and bring them to where I am." And that was the type of Prime Minister that we had in Owen Seymour Arthur. But it would be remiss of me, as one born on the Dutch side of the island of St. Martin, to a Barbadian mother and an Anguillian father, with a grandfather from Marigalant, and family members from Saba and Statia and St. Kitts and Antigua, and other parts throughout the region, not to highlight his commitment to regionalism and his commitment to the Caribbean single market and economy. In fact, I got the impression that during his 14-year tenure, once he felt that he had stabilized Barbados enough, his attention turned to the region, and he sought to create there what he had here. Unfortunately, he was not able to complete that task. But I believe the greatest tribute we can pay to the late Professor the Honorable Owen Arthur is to put our hands to the plow and strengthen the bonds of regionalism. Because if we did not believe it was important before, I believe COVID-19 has taught us, as Prime Minister Arthur probably would have read and probably would have recited sometime, that great poem by John Donne, "No man is an island, entire of itself, but each a part of a whole." And so if we want to celebrate and pay great tribute to the late Professor, the Honorable Owen Arthur Seymour, it is that all of us in public life will endeavor to not only continue to make this nation great, but seek to build stronger ties regionally, so that on the world stage we can be the force to be reckoned with that he deemed us. I take this opportunity to extend my sincere condolences to his wife Julie and his daughters Sabrina and Leah, who is not here with us, his brother Richard, and all other members of the family and close friends, and pray that as the days go by and as the pain of this present time dissipates, you can look back fondly on the great life that was Owen Seymour Arthur and all he would have done for us, and thanksgiving to God for placing so great a one amongst us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Rogers. His Honor, Senator Greenwich.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the very beginning, sir, I want to express sincere condolences to the entire Arthur family, to Julie, his wife, to Sabrina, the daughter, to Leah, the other daughter, to his brother Richard, his sister Valme, to Anne, to the entire Arthur and Ben family. So I want to begin this tribute by saying that in doing tributes, I never like to be anecdotal. I like to do a little commentary and so on, but I found it so difficult to do a tribute to Owen Arthur without being anecdotal. And I do this tribute, sir, not because I was a fellow politician. I do this tribute, sir, through the eyes of a boy from the most eastern tip of Barbados, a boy from Marleyville. Because when I lost Owen Arthur, I didn't lose just an academic. I lost, sir, more than a prime minister. I lost more than a politician. I lost more than a regionalist, sir. I lost more than an economist. Sir, I lost a genuine friend. Not just a superficial friend, sir. I lost a genuine friend. A friendship, sir, that I truly valued. I think it was Senator Wiggins this morning who reflected on the fact that Owen Arthur sat at the feet of Sir Lloyd Erskine Sandiford in sixth form, where Sir Lloyd taught political science. I too sat at those feet. I too was taught the same subject by Sir Lloyd. Myself and Owen Arthur went to Cave Hill. We were in the same year. Sir, in the late 60s and the early 70s at Cave Hill, we did 3 subjects in our first year. I did English, history, and economics. That is the way I loved those subjects. English, history, and economics. When Arthur turned that upside down, he did economics, history, and English. So while I was dropping economics after first year, he was dropping English after first year. But still, we had a first year in English together. And I have to tell you that we studied together. We used to call it beating books together in those days. And then, sir, during the Cave Hill holidays, Owen Arthur came to St. Philip in that same little corner, eastern corner, that I spoke about just now. He came to Marleyville, sometimes 3 times a week. He had to take at least 2 buses to get there. And I learned, sir, that the road to a friend's house is never too far. It's never too far. And we would walk from Marleyville, where I lived. You know, one of the first times he came, in fact, the very first time he came to my house, I introduced him to my mother as the future Prime Minister of Barbados. How prophetic. How pathetic. And you know, at that time he had absolutely no political ambition. I only said so because he was brilliant, because he was bright. That was the only reason why he said future Prime Minister of Barbados. As I said, sir, we would walk from Marleyville and we would go to Bayfield. At that time, you had to go across what was St. Catherine's cricket pasture. Very often, we would stop there, have a little game or watch the fellas. And he would be talking to people as we went along. So he knew people from that little corner of St. Philip since the early 70s. Since the early 70s, he knew the boys up there, and sometimes the old ladies up there as well. Very often we walked to Bayfield, the most easterly tip of the island, where the bus turns around. We walked there together. There's a house there where the Wedderburns live at. And that house was always our resting place. That is where we stopped. That was a house where we got anything we wanted virtually. Because once a lady by the name of Jessie Wedderburn knew that we were coming, boy, we got wilks, we got lobster, we got fish, we got sea eggs, you name it. Treated us royally. Sometimes we would spend the evening there. Sometimes we came back up to St. Catherine's pasture where the fellas were playing cricket by that time. But occasionally he would take the bus from the where the bus turned around, he would take the bus and go back down. But very early, he used to come to St. Philip. Tas was a real friend, not a pretended friend. It is said, sir, that an open foe may prove a curse, but a pretended friend is always worse. When Arthur was not a pretended friend, he was an absolute friend. An absolute friend. But even in those early days, when he came to St. Philip, you couldn't want a better friend socially. Whether he was playing dominoes, cards, cricket, or just having a drink, you couldn't want a person more affable, more witty. He was excellent company. Tas loved life. He enjoyed life. Now I have to tell you though, going back to our studies, that even though, yes, he did eventually drop English, still he dominated the first year English class. He dominated that. We were in English tutorials together. This is where you sit and you discuss and you talk man to man, you discuss your work. Myself and Owen Arthur often had different opinions. We argued about different points. Sometimes we interpreted them differently, and we held our own viewpoints. Owen Arthur was a lecturer's delight in tutorials. The lecturers sometimes enjoyed it. Not sometimes, they always enjoyed it when he was there. He dominated the tutorials. And I remember one of the best lectures that I have ever had. A gentleman by the name of Professor Scanlon, who taught English. And This was a day when there was a big football match at UWI, and it clashed around 4 o'clock with our tutorial class. We had to go to that football match because the UWI had a team that was extremely strong. We had about 3 or 4. There was a Ralph Farnham, Roland Mandeville, Oakley Brathwaite, and there was a wizard called Elliot McGuire from the island. We had an extremely strong team. Torn between the tutorial and the football game, myself and Owenatha decided we're skipping the tutorial today. We're going to football. And then, about 15 minutes or so later, while we were at the football, we looked and we saw our tutorial class, most of them coming. And when they reached us, we said, but there is no class on? They said, yes, the class actually started. But Professor Scanlon said, the class felt different. Something is missing. Class felt different. Something is missing. I know this something wasn't me. I know this something wasn't me. But that was the enormity of the man. That virtually he could cancel the class by not turning up. That was the enormity of Owenatha. The other thing I recall, and Senator Nurse did make the point earlier, when he spoke about helping people, helping students. You know, we had some poets, some metaphysical poets, they call them. Difficult to understand their language, difficult to understand their imagery, difficult to understand what they were writing. Difficult poets. And one of the most difficult ones was Alexander Pope. Difficult poet. And there was a gentleman in our class, I could call his name too, Ernest Rochford. Big fellow used to teach at Coleridge Parry. He was having difficulty in understanding the metaphysical poets. And he said, I can't understand when you're all in the tutorials and you're all talking. I just can't understand it. I'm confused. I don't know. And I said, Cappy, what are you doing tomorrow? This was a Friday. He said, what are you doing tomorrow? I said, I just reading books and gone. He said, why I come at 10 o'clock? We can go through 5 of Pope's poems with Rochi. He said, get here for 10. I slept that night in Martinique Road at an aunt. Owen slept that night, I think it was somewhere near Thorpe's. I think he had an uncle that had a shop or something like that. Correct? Yes. You know, old boys do remember. Yeah. And the morning, I got off by where the Kentucky is, somewhere down there in Black Rock. Walk up what we used to call the Free Hill. And go up to and when I got up to the top of the hill, honestly, I was panting, because it was just about 10. And when I got there, I looked across. He was walking, coming across the playing field. Rochi was there. And he said, let me go look for an empty lecture room. We got into the lecture room. We sat down. And from about 10 past 10 until about 12:30 or so, we went through about 3 poems. We took lunch, Rochi paid for the lunch. And then we came back again and we finished it off. We did 5, and he taught, and Rochi understood. exams would have been like 2 weeks away. And I remember when the exam finished, and it said, Rosie, where you get through. God, you had to do 4 questions in 3 hours, 4 essays. What he said, I get through. Could I do? He said, you did the question on Pope. He said, I do it first, because it was freshest in my mind. It was freshest in my mind. And he had a smile as broad as this room. I do it first. And all of that credit of when I could come here tomorrow. He said, Rochi taught me at school I can't bear to see him struggle. That was the measure of the man. I can't bear to see him struggle. And when you should have been preparing for your own exam, because the exam's just around the corner, you were sacrificing time and saying, I want to help the man who taught me. A week after his passing, Mr. Ezra Short, who is a sports journalist with the Nation, he called to ask me about Onatha's ability as a cricketer. And he said everybody was giving them information on him as a prime minister, on him as an economist and so on. He wanted somebody who knew him as a sportsman. Onatha prided himself as being an opening batsman. And very often, in fact, we had a very, very strong cricket team. That was a team that Ishmael Roy, the former Speaker of the House, captained. He captained that team. We had a very good team that won the second division trophy that year. And Onatha was not a regular member of the team. But Onatha always had his gear. On Saturdays, he would come to cricket. He would have his gear in a bag. If a fella didn't turn up, those weights were on. And he was out there substituting. It was the time I pulled a hamstring. I used to be a fast bowler. I had a good speed. And I slipped him into the team in my place. I didn't. And he made about 20 runs. Fellas who were more secure on the team made less than 20. He made 20 something. But the point is that when I began to improve, 2 weeks afterwards I walked back my play. And I'm in the nets. And Ishmael says, well, you have to prove that you're fit. And of all the people who would have been batting at the time that I was proving that I was ready to come back, it was Onatha. And here am I trying to bowl almost at my fastest. And I knew he didn't like short bowling. I gave him a couple of short ones. He didn't like it short. And he got struck twice on the shoulder. And then I hit his stumps about twice. And it looked as though there was only one man now to drop so that I could get back my place. And yes, he was dropped from the team. Owen dropped him. Roy dropped him. And it took about 3 weeks before we had a cordial conversation with each other again. Now, I also read in those tributes to him, the Nation had put out memorial publication. But Robert Morris, he said in his tribute that he was introduced to Owen Arthur by Cappy Greenwich. I didn't remember it, to be quite honest, but if Robert says so, it is so, because we were so close to each other that we might have been standing together on the occasion when he was so introduced. We were very, very good friends. But anyhow, let us fast forward to 1993. 1993, I am in that corner in Marleyville at about 9 o'clock in the morning. And there's a car horn, and I look out. Tass. We doing up here? Come to see you. He came in. And for 2 hours we were talking. We spoke about the weather. We talked about cricket. We talked about our days at Cave Hill. We talked about everything. And after 2 hours he said, but then the reason I come though, I was having a chat with David Simmons, and he told me talk to you. Cappy, I believe you is the only body in St. Philip to beat War Family. I want you to run. Just like that. And I believe I could have said no to anyone else. I believe I could have said no to the same David Simmons. I believe I could have said no to Henry Ford. I couldn't say no to Owen Arthur. I couldn't say no to Owen Arthur. I can say on the floor of this Senate without anybody contradicting me that I got into politics because of that. I became a politician because of TAS. Became Prime Minister in 1994. And it was at that time that my mother laughed and reminded me of the day that I introduced him as the future Prime Minister of Barbados. But you know, sir, the biggest lesson that he taught me is that the son of a carpenter, the son of a shopkeeper, that the son of any agricultural laborer, the son of a fisherman, of working class people, can rise to become the Prime Minister of Barbados. That lesson he taught me. He taught me that I could have a bosom friend who could become Prime Minister of Barbados. Someone from poor, humble background could achieve so much. I remember too, sir, being at an ILO conference. And while I was at that ILO conference, he was at a heads of government conference in England. I was in Geneva. And he would call me from England, where he was, every evening after the conference. We would chat about home, chat about everything. I remember his conference eventually ended before mine did. Now here is where I pick up. Sir, you know when you go, you would have gone on many occasions, when you make your speech at the conference and you come down and all of the other Caribbean ministers are there and they congratulate you on what a good speech you have made, whether it was good or not. Yes, I made a speech in Geneva And I came down, and I saw all of the Caribbean ministers there ready to meet me. Minister, good speech, minister, good speech. But when I got to the end of the Caribbean group, here was another gentleman who stood out. Stood out for a variety of reasons. Color was the most basic one. And he had a New Zealand tag on him. I remember his name, but I knew his name, but I just can't remember it. But he shook my hand, and he said, good speech. This is that. He said, but I am here to tell you that I like your Prime Minister. I said, my Prime Minister is not here. He said, I know that. He said, I was in London, where they had a heads of government meeting, and I'm covering 2 conferences where they came over now to this one in Geneva. And then he said, let me tell you why I like it. And he told me that the Prime Minister of England, Mr. Tony Blair at the time, was wrapping up the conference, the Heads of Government Conference. And he said, we have the document now. They're preparing the document. We have come to the end of the conference, so we can all go and have a drink before we have the final cocktails or whatever it was later in the evening. Chap from New Zealand said, your Prime Minister looked at Mr. Blair and said, no, sir, it cannot be done that way. We must take that document first, go over it line by line and word by word to see if we approve it. When we give it our approval, then that can happen, but not before. Prime Minister of England said, okay, well, in that case then, let's take a half an hour break and let's come back and look at the document. And they did that. The gentleman from New Zealand said, and do you know that substantial amendments, substantial changes were made to that document? And the majority of the suggestions came from your Prime Minister. Owen Seymour Arthur. But, you know, I came through London after that. And I was met by Mr. Peter Simmons. Mr. Peter, I think both him and Mr. Herbier, with Mr. Peter Simmons was the High Commissioner. I was met. And I, very naive as I am, naive person, I said, I heard that Mr. Arthur had a good conference and that he actually made the people do some changes. Peter Simmons looked at me and said, Cappy, you don't got to tell me that. But I was in the conference, I sat in the conference, and he proceeded to tell me, almost in the same way, exactly how it happened. And he said, not only that, Prime Minister Blair, he didn't say Blair, he said Prime Minister Blair's office, has called our office on about 2 or so occasions since then. And they're asking questions about Barbados. And about 4 months after that, Prime Minister Blair and his family were here in Barbados on their holiday. I put 2 and 2 together. And I said to myself, you know something? They have come to Barbados because they had a demonstration of the metal that Barbadians are made of. Owen Arthur has done a lot for this country. A good friend of mine. So, Mr. President, you know the time is getting on, but there are a few anecdotes, and I really don't want to go through all. But I have tried as much as possible to remove my political lens in the tribute and to speak for the many friends that Owen Arthur had in my neck of the woods. While he was, and even after he was Prime Minister, he continued to frequent the district in which I live. And I used to think at one stage that I was, well, I almost said the darling of some folks in Marleyville, the older folks and so on. But he proved to me that I was not. That because he took more liberties with those people than I did myself. One day he came up to Marleyville, came to my house. He said he's come from somewhere and he was just giving us a shout. He said, hop in. And I got in his car. He said, I'm going to give Masky a shout. 200 yards from me. And he goes, and he opens the door. He walks into Evelyn Skeet's kitchen. The pot is on the stove. He opens the pot. And something very basic like piece of yam, piece of breadfruit, and I think it was a dolphin head, not a dolphin head. That is what was being cooked. And he said, go and get some of that. And another 15 minutes we waited, and he got it, and I got some too. And he ate it as though it was caviar. You could see he was enjoying fellowship with them. That was the badger of Owen Arthur. I've never done that to any house in the district that I live in. He walked into the kitchen, opened the sauce, put it away cooking. That was the badger of the man. Towards the end of his political career, then according to him, he could count his friends on one hand. He came back to St. Philip a lot. And I could see what was happening. He sought cheerfulness. He sought consolation. He sought comfort. He sought solace in that part of the world. He even told me, well, I shouldn't say it. The daughter knows what he was almost about to say. But he loved that part of the world. And he would go at the same Evelyn Skeet's house up there, Morville Jordan's house. He would play dominoes at John Clark. And he found himself socializing, smiling, laughing, and being Owen Arthur once again. And I said to myself, and I will say it now, that's what friends are for. I'm obliged to you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Greenidge, and thank the honourable senators who spoke in tribute today, representing a wide perspective on a very full, interesting, and diverse life of the late Professor Owen Arthur. I want to associate myself with all of the remarks made. There's much that can be said, but I will not seek to add too much, except to say that, for me, if I look back on the almost now completed 5 decades of my life, and you look at these decades, and they're people of influence across the decades. And across the decades, Onatha represented the most significant influence on pretty much half of my life, and both in professional and personal ways. And he's been my leader, mentor, friend, and certainly this didn't relate to government alone, but certainly long after government, and in fact up to 2 weeks or so before he took ill, we had one of our usual conversations. When you work for someone who is extremely bright, extremely performance-driven, has a great eye for detail, you take your small victories in having an idea that you propose accepted, or having some language that you have produced accepted and incorporated into a speech or a document, and you take great pleasure, especially long after there's the end of any official professional relationships. In other words, he doesn't have to call you, but 10 years after you left government, 12 years after you left government, you get a call, and where's the party? What's going on? You behave yourself, and he bunks his ideas. Look, I'm working this industrial policy, so. And I'm pleased to say that, for example, in terms of the way our relationship was, that while he was working on that, there were several things that he wanted to check out in terms of Canada's industrial policy, in terms of my perspective as a former Minister of Industry, and such was our relationship. Personal, professional, that's after the family, and so on. But I won't go into all the details now, just to say that I can associate myself with all of the different perspectives mentioned. I'm particularly pleased that Senator Greenidge has focused a bit more on Onatha the man. One of the challenges is that public figures who are larger than life are sometimes either only or largely remembered by that which is in the public domain. And sometimes they become almost statuesque, as opposed to dynamic and moving human beings with adornments on one end, flaws on the other, a total a person. And Onatha, like all of us, we're complex. We are diverse. We enjoy the public participation, we enjoy the crowds, we enjoy the campaigns, we enjoy being among our people, but we also enjoy those quiet moments, even those moments of solitude. And St. Philip was one of those places, for example, that our late friend and brother would go for solitude, but over time he had others that he would reveal from time to time. For example, going up to places like Cove Bay and St. Lucie to sit and read a book. I know that he grew to love Silver Sands, and there was a place there just around Inchmarlow that he would go within sight of the water, prop up against a coconut tree to read a book. My wife even mentioned she was at Cogent Parry teaching there now for about 34 years. And sometimes on evenings, when she's leaving late after giving lessons, for example, and these were free lessons, by the way, this was not paid lessons. She didn't believe in that. But in all seriousness, she would mention sometimes that she would see this car, and it would be Prime Minister Onatha sitting in his car, relaxing in Cogent Parry. But obviously, things that he enjoyed and embraced, he never left. St. Philip, as one of the loves of his youth, Cogent Parry, his family, his friends, certain places, so that these tributes today captured a lot of that rich diversity, the human side, the professional side. And I think it is very difficult to capture the essence of an entire life, a life that was not only rich in and of itself, but has forever changed Barbados. has forever captured what is best about our society. That we live in a society, notwithstanding its flaws, is one in which a person's origin at birth cannot be a limiter or predictor of what their destination will be at the end of their rich and wonderful life. And I believe that as Owen worked through his social, economic, political policies, he recognized, he understood history, his own history and history of our society. But I think that he saw in every child that he met, Senator Nurse's, the little boy that was with your sister, for example, he saw in every child a potential prime minister, or the person who will solve the next disease or produce the best art in the world. And he saw part of his role as mentoring everyone. He mentored us as ministers, but it wasn't just at this level. Everyone. He really invested in them in the way that people invested in him along his journey to greatness. I want to thank him for the opportunity that he has given me and for the times that we have shared. And especially, like I said, you know, you work with someone or you work with people and, okay, that's fine. But it's when people don't have to deal with one another, let's put it that way. So I don't work with you or I don't live next door to you. So there's no reason why we have to do it. And we do it, you know that this is really the real deal. I would say that our conversations over the last 12 years, exchange of ideas and so on, have been moments to cherish, and especially in the last few months, where he was very excited about making a contribution towards once again rescuing Barbados in the context of a world situation that had changed dramatically. So all of the old assumptions had been swept away, and he loved the challenge of looking at what exactly is this new world? What are the new assumptions? What new model of economic development and social development, while keeping our people dignified and keeping our society cohesive and holding on to some of the old values, but building a new way of earning our way in the world. And he was really excited by those, and we had lots of conversations in that regard. I want to thank family for the sacrifice that they have made. All of us, especially Cappy, who've been around, Senator Greenwich has been around as long as they have, many of us. Our families pay a price for us being in public life. The quality time that we spend with the public is the time that we don't spend in private with our families. Mercifully, they survive. Not because of us, but in spite of us. And I really want to say to the Arthur family that you all have been emblematical of the issues which other families in public life has faced, and given the level to which Owen had risen, yours is even a tougher journey. And I thank you for spending the time with us today. And we know that losing someone as near and dear and as treasured as he was to you and to all of us cannot be easy. But we hope that the genuine outpouring of admiration, of affection, the remembrances that have been laid out here, professional, personal, and so on, will certainly help to ease the pain of his loss, but also to let you know some of the great contributions which he has made. And I'll end by saying this. Sometimes we don't quite get our sense of our place in history, but remember at our chambers in Hero Square, somewhere in the 1990s, maybe early 2000s, a project was started by the late clerk George Branker, and I believe inspired by a request from Dame Billy Miller and Owen Arthur to recognize the members of the House of Assembly since adult suffrage in 1951, because that, for all people to understand of history, represented a different parliament for a different purpose. a parliament truly representative of all the people in this society. And really, the numbers are not large. When you consider that most people will do at least 2 terms, 3 terms, some have done, as in Nolan's case, 34 years and so on. And he stands out as one of those great parliamentarians. And I look forward, I won't say I look forward, I won't be here 100 years from now, but future generations will, as they research his contribution, be able to draw not only on the official records in government, but be able to draw on the record of this chamber and of the other place, as we have joined in our reflections. And I look forward to you, Julie, and Sabrina, Leah, Richard, and the whole family, being able yourselves in due course to reflect on the record and to smile, to ease the pain of the loss. So I want to thank once again our honourable senators for the contribution. There's a resolution in which we will encapsulate our admiration and respect for an outstanding former member of this chamber, and I would invite Senator McConney to move the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. President. With your comprehensive conclusion to the tributes made in memory of Professor the Right Honorable Owen Arthur, I move the adoption of the following motion, of the following resolution. Whereas Professor the Right Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur and one of Her Majesty's councils passed this life on the 27th of July 2020, and whereas Professor Arthur was a member of the Senate from 1983 to 1984, a member of the House of Assembly from 1984 to 2018, leader of the opposition 1993 to 1994, and 2010 to 2013, Prime Minister of Barbados from 1994 to 2008, an independent member of Parliament from 2014 to 2018. And whereas this distinguished economist, longest serving and highly successful Prime Minister, achieved unprecedented success in transforming the socio and economic landscape of Barbados. And whereas this brilliant economist presided over the longest period of economic stability the country had experienced, evidenced by record levels of foreign reserves, substantial tax breaks, and wage increases coupled with massive foreign and local investment. And whereas that brilliance shone on the tapestry of the political economy, where he sought to address the toughest issues facing the country. One such issue was the vexing one of unemployment, which stood at 24% when he took office, and by the time he left it, had been wrestled down to the new low of 7.4%, prompting scholars to ask, what was the natural rate of unemployment in Barbados? And whereas this strident regionalist, in his relentless pursuit and advocacy for the advancement of the CARICOM single market and economy, would be propelled into the role of chief architect and intellectual guide of the CARICOM single market and economy in 2006, and a champion of its cause with vigor, clarity, and determination. And whereas this son of humble origins brought to the political stage the quintessential intellectual mix of economics and politics, which represented a shift from the traditional law and politics, and to a lesser extent, medicine and politics, a unique mix of skills that would serve him well in the period into which he was to be immediately thrusted consequent upon the 1994 election campaign, and for which he would thereafter receive extraordinary regional and international acclaim for his management of the economy. And whereas the nature of the late Professor Arthur's service in his several endeavors was characterized by the generous employment of his prodigious gifts of a transcendent intellect, ebullient charm, remarkable leadership, elevated by the ability to motivate and inspire by example, wedded to economic proficiency. And whereas his service was an amalgam of these skills with visionary ideas, clarity of purpose, pragmatism, meticulous preparation, and sheer hard work, along with Barbadian aesthetic and Caribbean ideal, to forge unimaginable and unprecedented success for Barbados, giving it an altogether new luster in the world. Be it resolved that this honorable Senate shares the sorrow felt by a grateful nation and extends its deepest sympathies to his wife Julie, children Sabrina and Leah, siblings Valmay, Richard and Patricia, and relatives of the late Professor the Right Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur, and expresses its wishes that they be confronted by the memory of a life lived selflessly and in the service of his nation and his people. Dated this 30th day of September, 2020. Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Connie. I ask you all now to rise in the vote of condolence. His soul continue to rest in peace and rise in glory.
Was the resolution adopted? Was the resolution adopted? Did we have to? I move.
Mr. President, I beg to move that we now suspend for a period of 10 minutes, return for the continuation of this sitting.
The question is that this sitting be suspended for 10 minutes, which means we resume at until 4:55. 4:55. Those honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. This sitting is accordingly suspended until 4:55 p.m. today.